Very rarely does an entire team disappear in one fell swoop. Especially one with such potential, such value in a name, and in such an unfair and cruel manner. One team in particular was Graham Hill's very own team in the 1970s, Embassy Hill Racing. Now before we get all nostalgic, I have to point out that as a Formula One team, Embassy Hill did not do particularly well in terms of results, and were not seen as a very strong contender. However, though, it looked like that they were just at the beginning of an upswing, and at the end of the 1975 season, it seemed apparent that they had the car, the driver, and things were beginning, finally, to look positive. Until one tragic night where in an instant, Embassy Hill Racing was no more. So in order to understand how this whole thing began, let's get reacquainted with Graham Hill. The man was an absolute machine on the track, 5-time Monaco Grand Prix winner, 2-time world champion, Le Mans 24 Hours winner, and an Indy 500 winner, thus making him the only driver to this day to win the Motorsport Triple Crown. Bearing in mind, most F1 drivers today won't touch the Indy 500 on the grounds that it's not safe, it's highly dangerous. Even today with cutting edge safety, carbon fibre monocoques, aero screens, accidents do happen. But back in Graham's heyday, he was effectively driving a fuel tank covered with a thin coating of aluminium. Imagine driving 180 miles per hour in a Coke can full of fuel, and if you got the tiniest thing wrong, that was it. You were pretty much gone. And that was the case in all motorsports at the time. There was not much walking away after big accidents. So overall then, Graham Hill, deadly serious on the circuit, and a serious scallywag off it. But that is a story for another day. So first things first, we need to throw our minds back to 1972. An unsatisfied Graham Hill announced that he was leaving the Brabham team after a very disappointing 2-year stint. However, at 43 years old, and bearing in mind this is before fitness and nutrition and all this sort of thing, he was getting on a bit. F1 was looking more and more to him like a young man's sport. As much as he was trying to deny it, Graham was knocking on a bit. And also, team bosses weren't really very excited about hiring a relic from yesteryear. They didn't really click what they were looking for. But good old Graham, he wasn't having any of it, and he had to embrace that, saying, if you want something done properly, you've got to do it yourself. And it's very understandable that Graham would have this mindset. He was a 2-time world champion. Even at this point, he was still one of the biggest names in the business. He had high standards and a belief that he could continue in F1 by himself, under his own name. And with that then, Graham announced that he was going to found his own Formula One team with himself as driver, team manager and owner. Which compared to modern F1 teams today, where some employ over 1,000 people, that sounds completely and utterly mental. But also bear in mind, this was at a time where a team could only consist of a handful of people and be absolutely fine at the end of the day, as long as you had a Mart chassis, a Cosworth engine, and a Hewland gearbox and Goodyear tyres, and some very clever mechanics and people, you were good to go. And this all sounds very exciting and everything, but getting back to the point, this was the only way Graham could get a drive for 1973 and ultimately stay in Formula One. Because this was not a man who was ready to give up, not ready to accept that he was getting older, and retirement was simply not an option. And also astonishingly, even by modern F1 standards, this tiny team which Graham was running managed to secure a title sponsorship by Embassy Tobacco. A small team at the back to have these massive Embassy cigarette branding was just unheard of at the time, and he was already using his own weight in Formula One. So let's just take stock very quickly and list off some of the job responsibilities he had at Embassy Hill Racing. Graham was of course the owner, the team manager, the driver obviously, commercial director, advertising director. Honestly, the list of what Graham was involved in is endless compared to the rigidity and job titles of you find in F1 today. God knows how he managed to get any sleep, and I'm sure if any of you have ever started companies as well in the past, I'm sure you can relate to this. At the end of the day, this was just a startup Formula One team. But from a commercial standpoint, for a completely new team to have absolutely no guarantees on performance or even future, also managed by a driver who's over the hill, to secure this kind of sponsorship was absolutely massive. Now, wouldn't you just love to sit in on that sales pitch that Graham must have given to the people at Embassy? Man, that would have been something. Now, as an established motorsport personality, Graham used his experience and contacts to great advantage, securing a supply of hearty Ford Cosworth V8 engines, but with the very average, though, Shadow DN1 customer chassis. Customer cars are, of course, banned in Formula One today, but this was at a time where you could pretty much just pick an old one off the shelf. And yes, it may not have been cutting edge, or even the design maybe a few years old, but ultimately, the thinking was that this car, in the right hands with the right people and right frame of mind, he could get his foot in the door, at least. But it does take you back to a time where there was much more freedom in the sport, and with the right ingredients and the right people and the right backing, anyone could theoretically get from the bottom to the top. After all, Williams started life using customer Brabham and March chassis, and then went on to become one of the greatest F1 teams of all time. In my opinion, why deny others of this opportunity? But anyway, back on topic. So Embassy Hill looked good on paper and everything was starting to come together. Everything was looking ready to go for the 1973 season, and he had his own trusted mechanics and engineers along for the ride. But despite all their gung-ho attitude, punching above their weight sponsorship, knowledge and experience, it was anything but a ride. Probably more of a depressing, hitting your head against the wall sort of thing. Their debut season in 1973 was a long, hard slog for Embassy Hill, and I wonder if Graham ever thought that he might have just bitten off a bit more than he could chew. After all, he was still juggling all these titles within the team, but also, let's not forget, also husband and father. So that's all these things he's got to contend with. Graham was clearly excellent at many things, but unfortunately delegating was not one of them. Now granted, at first the results were not great. However though, they didn't have as many DNFs as other teams, so at least there was reliability, but unfortunately though, the speed, they hadn't quite got there yet. But I'm sure we can all agree though, the Embassy Hill cars did look fantastic. This elegant and clean white and red livery just encapsulating this brutish power of this 1970s Formula One car. A time where speed, looks, mechanical grip and handling were all at the forefront of the mind, whereas safety and economics kind of took a bit of a back seat. Now, by their second season in 1974, Embassy Hill had hired a second driver in the form of Guy Edwards and commissioned Lola to build a new car for them. The Shadow customer chassis just weren't up to the job, and they brought in the big Lola name to sort them out. And things began pretty well. Graham scored the team's first points at the 74 Swedish Grand Prix, but even with that, a number of DNFs and DNQs did start to affect the team. Times were tough, the pressure was on, and things weren't helped by Graham just kind of getting on a bit, unfortunately, and he was really starting to feel the strain. This same car they used again in the 1975 season, and Graham Hill, unfortunately at this stage, reached rock bottom. The five-time Monaco Grand Prix winner, Mr. Monaco, failed to qualify for that year's Monaco Grand Prix, and Graham shortly afterward announced his retirement from Formula One. He'd finally realised that the game was up, and it was time just to hang up the helmet, take a back seat, sit on the pit wall, and let a young man who's hungry and talented have a go. But for Graham and the team, it was for the greater good, as retirement from driving would allow him to prioritise on management and other areas that needed vital attention. And Graham immersed himself purely as a team manager. He hired new staff to take over from his previous roles, and also let the young and promising British Formula 3 driver Tony Brise have a go. And apparently Tony Brise really impressed Graham Hill, because when he turned up to the team's garage at Woking, he arrived and said, "Right, where's my bloody car?" So yeah, worth bearing in mind when you start a new job. Goes down well apparently. But it's worth bearing in mind that Brise made the decision to go to Embassy Hill Racing after declining a drive for a little known family racing operation called Frank Williams Racing. At the time, it just appeared that Embassy Hill was the better option, and just to kind of soak up all this knowledge that Graham had, which was a lot more than Frank had at the time. And it did pay off, because only in his 9th race, Brise qualified 6th ahead of the likes of Messrs, Hunt, Reutemann, Peterson and Andretti. All of those names are just 1970s F1 royalty. His engine, unfortunately, though, wouldn't last the race, and he would have to retire, but it did show the enormous potential that was there, and his talent didn't go unnoticed. And by this point, the team had given the Lola chassis some vast upgrades. They'd christened it now the GH1, with all the intention that Brise could give the front runners some hassle. And this was it, the GH1, their very own named car, all in the hope that the GH name would then become its own dynasty. The thought was in the future we could see a GH10, GH15, GH20, much like we saw with Williams and the FW11, FW14 or FW18. And so finally, Graham had the driver he wanted, so he knew that he could retire comfortably and take up fully the role of team manager. And things got even better, with Brise scoring a point at the 75 Swedish Grand Prix. And Embassy Tobacco, their title sponsor, realised now that this was a small team that was going places. We could actually fund this and get it into a massive F1 operation. So they increased the budget and threw much more money at the whole operation. So Graham now had the money, he had the momentum, he had the people, He now just had to build the car. And that's exactly what they did. Out of their small premises in Woking, Embassy Hill built their very own scratch-built car called the GH2 for the 1976 season. You know the famous season, 1976, James Hunt, Niki Lauda in the movie Rush? Well, Graham's car was going to be in this year. And it was a great looking car. It was sleeker, it was lighter, it was less bulky, and apparently it was 5 kilograms lighter than its predecessor, the GH1. And that is a noticeable amount in Formula One, even back then. And in the autumn of 1975, Brise tested the GH2 car at Silverstone and later at Paul Ricard, and everyone was very encouraged by the performance. Everyone was optimistic about the 76 season ahead, and all the hard work, sleepless nights, stress and everything was finally going to pay off. Brise even telexed the factory at Woking saying, "Car now brilliant, test ended, see you all on Monday morning." And then later boarded Embassy Hill's private plane, piloted by Graham Hill. Of course he's a pilot. And also with team manager Ray Brimble, designer Andy Smallman and mechanics Terry Richards and Tony Alcock to fly back to Elstree Airfield in the UK. But sadly, that plane with everyone on board, all those key figures, never landed at Elstree. On the 29th of November 1975, on a dark foggy night, the aircraft crashed on Arkley Golf Course after colliding with a line of trees on approach, thus killing everybody on board. And because of that cruel, unfair twist of fate and just sheer loss of people, Embassy Hill Racing was no more. And just in an instant, Formula One had lost one of its greatest legends ever in Graham Hill and one of its most promising prospects in Tony Brise. We were deprived of what was looking to be a very positive year for Embassy Hill and what was going to be the first step in what could have been a future great team. Honestly, this was well and truly the Munich air disaster of Formula One. Obviously on a much smaller scale, but still an entire team just wiped out. And unfortunately afterwards, it was decided that the team could not continue. It was closed indefinitely and the assets were sold off, as the team now consisted of just 3 individuals. It would have just been impossible to continue. Putting this into a modern perspective, it's the same as a team chartering a massive Boeing or an Airbus to fly all the crew back from a practice session and that going down. If the same was to happen to a team today, they would never be able to continue. That sheer loss of personnel, it just couldn't happen. And much was the same with Embassy Hill Racing. But it's amazing to think just what might have been, you know, wins, pole positions, championships, maybe even mediocrity, who knows. But perhaps there could have been another white and red liveried team that was making its way up the grid. And I know it's slightly different to what I normally do on the channel, but it's just one of those most fascinating stories that I love reading about. It's brilliant. So anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you later. Thanks very much.